I've been making art for the liturgy, mainly for Catholic parishes, for around 12 years. And I started in 2012 as Aidan's apprentice. In around 2017, I began as an artist running my own small workshop. And what I learned on in the first week as Aidan's apprentice is that I was expected to have conversations about the church fathers and astrophysics in the America's Cup while trying to paint or carve or make mosaics. So people like Aidan and people like all of you have lots of interesting ideas every day. But in the last 12 years, I've had one that I can remember. And 20 minutes or maybe 15 minutes is plenty of time to present it to you. It's nothing original, but I hope it's relevant. So my one idea about art in the liturgy is based on 3 premises and 1 question. The first premise is about the orientation of our Catholic worship. Our worship is orientated towards heaven, and therefore it is orientated towards a reality that we cannot see. And this heavenward orientation of our Catholic worship is evoked several times in Sacrosanctum Concilium. For example, at the beginning of the 8th paragraph, in the earthly liturgy, we take part in a foretaste of that heavenly liturgy, which is celebrated in the holy city of Jerusalem, towards which we journey as pilgrims. In the earthly liturgy, we take part in a foretaste of that heavenly liturgy, which is celebrated in the holy city of Jerusalem, towards which we journey as pilgrims. The second premise is that because of its orientation towards something we cannot see, the liturgy is par excellence the place in which the visible is subordinated and ordered towards the invisible. This is true of everything we do as spirited bodies, but it is especially true within the Mass, where all our gestures, all our postures, and all our words should be orientated towards something invisible. It is also true of all the things we make for the liturgy, all the stuff we need to make the liturgy happen, whether it's a vestment or a chalice or a cathedral. What is visible is subordinated to the invisible. My third premise is illustrated by this gospel cover, which was made by a Benedictine monk in the 12th century in what is now Germany. It is that liturgical objects have 2 roles to play. The first is to practically facilitate the rite. The second is to manifest the invisible thing which the rite is orientated towards. So this gospel cover is practically useful. It protects the vellum pages of the gospel book from damage. And when it's clamped closed, it also keeps them flat and stops them from warping. So it's really a piece of technology. But it also manifests visibly what is invisible. This is no ordinary book. When the sacred scriptures are read in the church, so says the general instruction of the Roman Missal, God himself speaks to his people. When such a gospel book as this is carried in procession, perhaps up onto an ambo, with its bejeweled and glorified cross and winged beasts, what is evoked and enacted is an eschatological vision of the Son of Man appearing at the end of history. In other words, when the sacred scriptures are read, Christ comes again. So this liturgical object facilitates the rite, but it also manifests visibly what is invisible. So, to summarize my 3 premises, which are really 1 premise, our worship is orientated towards heaven, something we cannot see. In the liturgy, what is visible is subordinated to the invisible. And as well as being practically useful, liturgical objects ought to use signs and images to manifest invisible things. So I promised 3 premises and 1 question. My question is this. Since our worship is orientated towards what is invisible, and since we have such a rich tradition of combining images with liturgical objects to manifest this orientation, why, as Catholics in 2024, do we so often find ourselves in churches and in liturgies where there are few images or only poor images within the sanctuary? And my idea, which might form part of an answer to this question, is that one of the reasons for this often stark absence is not theological or ideological or something to do with liturgy wars, but something very practical. And I'm going to show you a few examples of liturgical objects to explain what I mean. So those of you from the States, this painting is now only an hour away, so if you have time to go to the National Gallery, you can probably make it. It was originally painted for a small chapel in a Camaldolese monastery. The chapel was dedicated to St. John the Baptist, and it's in Piero della Francesca's hometown in Tuscany. And it was painted in the 14th century, or no, the 15th century. I introduced it as a painting, but really it's a piece of sacred furniture because, of course, originally it was an integral part of an altar. And it's a really good example of the way in which, in worship ad orientem, an altar can be decorated in such a way that its invisible orientation is made clearly visible. So just to begin with the basics of the composition, there's this strong vertical axis, this line of connection which runs through Christ and connects the ground and the Jordan to the sky. And there's also a horizontal axis created by the landscape. And if you look, you can see there's a circle described in the upper half of the image, and the bottom of the circle lines up with the top of Christ's loincloth. So it kind of continues through the whole image. And in the bottom, there's a square, which is obvious enough. So there are two axes forming a cross. There are a circle and a square intersecting. So it's an image of sacrifice, and it's an image of heaven and earth coming together. And heaven and earth coming together is what Pope Benedict described as the true meaning of sacrifice in the spirit of the liturgy. So the church is the meeting place of heaven and earth, and the altar is the point of contact. But if you look carefully at the painting, you can see that it's further divided into three sections. In the center, you have the revelation of the Holy Trinity, God the Son, God the Spirit in the form of the dove, and implied at least the voice of the Father. And on the left, you have three angels who are bearing witness and also, I guess, ministering. And on the right, you have this curious guy who's taking off his top, ready to get into the Jordan, and wearing Y fronts, which I think is interesting in terms of the history of clothing. And the arc of his body leads really nicely into the figure of Christ. But what I want to argue is that this threefold division of the painting corresponds to the threefold division of a traditional altar. So in a traditional altar, you have the gospel side on our left, as it were, if we were looking towards this image, the epistle side on our right, and in the center, a space reserved more or less for the Eucharistic prayer. So let's briefly imagine Mass being said before this image. The penitent preparing for baptism would be directly above the epistle side of the altar, where among other forms of liturgical preparation, a priest would be reciting the introit, reading the epistle, and reciting the lavabo prayers while ceremonially washing his hands. Wash me, O Lord, from my iniquity, as the Novus Ordo has it. So these lavabo prayers said directly beneath a man taking off his clothes in preparation for baptism. And the reading of the gospel on the left side of the altar, both during Mass and directly after its conclusion, with the reading of the prologue of St. John's Gospel, angels are bearing witness to a divine revelation. We have seen his glory. We have seen his glory. Words that would have been proclaimed after the conclusion of each Mass. In the center of the altar, the tabernacle, the penitential rite, Kyrie eleison, the Eucharistic prayer with the words of consecration. This is my body. These words, said directly beneath the half-naked, descending body of Christ, bright as the host, which when raised at the elevation would hover for a moment beneath the painted image of the Holy Spirit. This then is a painting, a piece of liturgical furniture, which masterfully unfolds over the course of the liturgical rite. It provides a place for Mass to be celebrated and also manifests its inner meaning. At each point, it makes visible what is invisible. In it, the visible is subordinated, directed, arranged, ordered, ordained even, to the invisible. It opens up a vista. It provides a direction of travel, an orientation. So, my one idea is this, and it's really a very obvious one. Practically speaking, in worship versus populum, the space where images had provided a point of orientation towards the invisible for 800 years or so, the space directly above the east side of the altar, previously inhabited by a tabernacle and an altarpiece, is no longer available for that purpose. And in this brief 60 years since worship versus populum has become the norm, we haven't fully rediscovered other places within the sanctuary where images can play an important role. And why does it matter? We're not in Christendom anymore, or we're not going back to Christendom. Why does it matter in the age in which we live? I think if our formative experiences of worship lack a manifest orientation to invisible things, it's difficult to learn how to prioritize what is unseen in our daily life. How can we learn to inhabit a spiritual and moral world different and often in opposition to the one around us? On the other hand, if our liturgy speaks clearly of the transcendent, then perhaps we will have more strength to resist what the philosopher Charles Taylor has described as the immanent frame of the dominant culture in which we live. Perhaps we will have more conviction to speak to our peers of what we have both seen and heard, as St. Paul writes in the book of Acts. To be clear, my one idea is not that worship versus populum necessarily leads to churches lacking invisible signs of the invisible. It is only a practical idea that priests now occupy the space we had been accustomed to reserve for images, and we have not yet adjusted to this new arrangement of the sanctuary. Since it's so close to the ground and lower than the celebrant, the altar fronted itself is not really a suitable place for any image which is intended as a point of devotional orientation. For much of the time, for those of us who sit in the pews in churches with few images or mundane architecture, the celebrant priest has become the central focus of our attention. It's entirely human to look towards someone facing us and speaking, even if, as is the case for much of the Mass, they are not truly facing or addressing us at all, but rather orientated towards God the Father and speaking on our behalf. So, the 12th century apse of the Church of San Clemente in Rome, a sanctuary full of images and also full of biodiversity. The cross depicted here in the upper apse as the ever-abundant tree of life. Beneath it, the apostles, the Mother of God, Christ. But not a church, as is often the case in Rome's basilicas, where worship ad orientem is even possible, since there is a vertical drop on the west side of the altar. Nevertheless, a church full of images. Here, the images in the apse serve the same purpose as an altarpiece, but they adopt a slightly different strategy. Instead of providing a central point of orientation, they wrap around the altar and the baldacchino. They evoke heaven's participation in our worship and the encompassing power of the cross. The apostles in the lower apse form one half of a community that is completed by worshippers within the nave, the heavenly and the earthly church standing together before the throne. The tendrils of the tree of life extend ever outwards, over the gathered community, and then onwards to envelop the entire cosmos. Just as with an altarpiece, these images draw our attention to the altar, but this has become not so much a destination of travel, as is the case where an altar and an altarpiece are against the east wall, but the axis mundi around which the world revolves. And just like a brief word on baldacchinos, the altar has another a practical limitation in that it's the most important object within the sanctuary. It's the symbol of Christ present in the midst of the church as priest, altar, and victim, but it has like a limited height. It can't be more than a meter, and so it can be easily dwarfed in a large church. It's its nature that it has to be a certain size. So one of the roles of an altarpiece is just to make the altar bigger, right? Just to make it more visually prominent within the space. And it was the critique of the liturgical movement that altarpieces, which were intended to draw attention to the altar, end up distracting from it because they become the kind of venue for architectural fancy. And so when liturgical movement architects in the 20th century reordered churches, like the reordering of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, and they moved the altar away from the altarpiece, they almost always built a baldacchino over it, because by itself, the altar doesn't have enough gravity in a way to draw your attention to it. So the baldacchino is a really useful and I think underused way of providing that focus on the altar. And also, I mean, this is a different idea, but if you had a hanging tabernacle within the baldacchino, you'd avoid a rather awkward liturgical distinction between the tabernacle and the altar, which sometimes can happen. So this is just one example, and we have plenty of precedents to draw on, plenty of things to inspire us in considering the role of liturgical objects and images in masses celebrated versus populum, or in masses where there's no altarpiece. Right, slide. So just to conclude with one of these images you've already seen. Aidan painted it last year. And the image on the right is a hanging crucifix for Aberdeen Cathedral, which my colleague Jim Blackstone and I painted last year. It's about 3 meters high. It weighs about 150 kilos. It's double-sided. So, both these things are ways of repopulating the church with figurative images and also of refocusing our attention on the altar and manifest visibly what's happening invisibly there. And the cross was a good example of a project in which we're able to train other people. We had about 6 apprentices coming over the course of about 8 months to help paint it. So that's it. Thanks for listening.